a fun little experiment that became a habit. So we are now well into our COVID conversations. It's a weekly event that the Santa Barbara City College Foundation hosts. And really the goal behind all of this is to share some of the tremendous things that happen, oftentimes unseen by the majority of our community, and sometimes even unseen by our fellow staff, faculty, students, and others on campus here at Santa Barbara City College. It was certainly spurred on by the COVID-19 pandemic and the remote environment in which we all found ourselves. But what we found is that there are some really fascinating things happening and some doors that open through these conversations. So we're delighted to have you all with us today, and we're delighted to have our guests. I want to say that this particular session was dreamed up in the context of if you think about everything that happens on a college campus, we started off with our college superintendent president talking about this pivot to remote learning. We talked about how do you support students in their basic needs in a time like this. So we invited the leadership of our equity and EOPS departments. We've talked to folks about mental health and wellness and brought on colleagues from the WELL and our mental wellness services. And we've just continued to sort of explore. Last week we had Professor Matt Mooney on talking about the various ways in which learning can be effectively adapted to remote and online technology. So today we're going to jump into some of the actual content. People know that Santa Barbara City College is a #1 ranked college in many different ways over many different years recently. And so the arts and the sciences have sort of hold center stage at many colleges, and yet they're very different kinds of disciplines or sets of disciplines. So what we wanted to do today is invite a renowned faculty member in each of the areas to talk to us a little bit about how they do, what they're learning, what they're sharing, and to talk about this moment in which they're continuing to teach in this new way. So I'm very happy to introduce to you today our two guests. We have first, you're going to hear from Joy Kunz. Joy is with art history, as many of you know, and I'm looking at who's on this call, and you do know this. But Joy is a professor of art history here. She actually did her undergraduate at a small liberal arts college. You may have seen her bio. She stumbled into an art history class, fell in love with it, and here she is all these years later, which is one of my favorite stories of how teachers become. She got her MA at St. Louis University and then came back here and came to Santa Barbara to get her PhD at our very own University of California, Santa Barbara. So we are going to hear from her first. Second, we are going to hear from Professor Blake Barron. Blake is with biological sciences, and he got his BA in physiology and cell biology and an MA in biological sciences at UCSB as well. He actually joined the Santa Barbara City College faculty in 1999, so he's a 21-year veteran now of this place. Outside of the classroom, he's been very involved in other things as well, from STEM transfer program to tutoring programs, the PAL program, all kinds of other engagements. So both of these faculty members really are not only experts in their field, but they're highly visible and highly engaged faculty for our college. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Joy Kunz to begin. Joy.
Hi, thanks for asking me to talk about embracing distance learning. I'm one of 2 full-time faculty in art history at Santa Barbara City College. And so starting the end of last spring, we offered everything for a finish of the spring semester, and will offer all of our full array of courses online in the fall. So that's been a big adjustment, and my comments will be about what art history, not studio folks, but art history, what that looks like teaching online with my 1 year of experience. I have designed an art history course that I started teaching in 2019. Otherwise, my experience is just transforming within 2 weeks, a set of 5 different courses to be online when they were face-to-face. So, especially getting ready for the fall semester, it's allowed me to think about from sort of top to bottom how I'm going to design these courses so that they're rigorous and meaningful and approachable for students. So for me, art history is an interesting subject matter that most students really like once they've been introduced to it. They discover that they like learning about art and, you know, in its cultural context. But unlike some other disciplines, they don't bring any past experience in the discipline. So I find that the introduction to the subject matter is really important to set the tone. And I typically rely on my own passion for the subject matter. And that is that gets sent in a different context in the online format. So I put some time into thinking about how to introduce the subject. And part of that for me is my own enthusiasm and passion. So I have to put a personality behind the teacher. So people see who the instructor is. So I started out, and this might seem really basic to most of you, but I start out with an introduction, and usually introductions go both ways. So I have a page where I introduce myself. There's some pictures of me. And I want to underscore that it's not just a ramble, but it's in the context of a cultural context. We all come from a cultural and historical context. And the way I teach art history is that we understand and appreciate the work of art more when we understand its context. The same with people too. You know, you understand, appreciate them more when you get a sense of where they've been, where they're coming from. So I ask the students to do that too. So they introduce themselves via video or written or photographs. And that's one way of putting a face and a little bit of a personality between instructor and student. Secondly, you know, I've like many of you tuned into Matt Mooney's webinars and other resources for humanizing online instruction, and it's helped me to dive more deeply into the tools that Canvas provides us. And so I took up these Friday video chats, and they're pretty short. I use them to talk about strategies and upcoming assignments. And then because the lockdown of COVID was so dramatic in the spring, I thought, well, I have to sort of show the world that I have now. And so I made this commitment that I would go to different places in my house or my garden and make my weekly chat from these different places. And I think maybe the best one, I have chickens that I've named after historical female figures. And so some of my video chats, I would be holding my chicken, and then I'd talk a little bit about the historical contribution that namesake had made, and then we go ahead and talk about what's coming up for the week or what we just accomplished. And whatever the chicken would do or say was, you know, in it. Yeah, and then I would go around and find a work of art that I live with that I thought was relevant to, in some small way, to the class and what we've been studying. So I really tried to share a part of me with what our class was doing. And that worked in the spring, and so I want to bring that forward. And again, it's very simple and technologically very simple. But my experience is that students do well with something that's simple and direct and not too many bells and whistles. Secondly, I want to talk about conveying the material and the conceptual understanding of art history effectively. So I decided to make recorded lectures. So students get to hear my voice and they hear the emphasis that I give, hopefully the passion that I have for the subject matter. And I'm recording those over the digital presentations that I make in class using a pretty rudimentary technology of Snagit, but it's working for me. It was pretty painful in the beginning to listen to myself lecture when I would double check it. And so I tried to speed up my speech pattern, and then I tried to undo some of the intonations that I didn't like. And so at least it's a little less painful for me to listen to myself now. But the feedback is that students like that, and they listen to the lecture, they can pause it when they take notes off of it. So it, you know, I think it's working pretty well. the let's see, what else do I want to say? Oh, the challenge is that the images aren't very impressive on a small computer screen and certainly not on a phone. So part of the beauty of art history is sitting in a dark classroom and, you know, looking at these incredible images that come up. But the win is if I teach asynchronously, which I decided to do, that when students miss a class face-to-face, then they miss a lot of the contextual you know, information that I give. And in theory, with online, they're not missing any conceptual information, or they're not missing a class. And so I think that that has a real value. I made a commitment to make a personalized response to every discussion post and every written submission that a student made. And so I did that for 5 classes, every student. I have 2 submissions per student per week. So that was another way that I humanized myself, and it was my assurance to them that someone, me, the teacher, was looking at what they were writing and producing and giving it thought. And then if they were not on the right track, I could make an adjustment that was really personalized to them. The other thing that I did was incorporate discussion topics. So discussion topics happen in the classroom during lecture, you know, and I think my discussions were more historically and sort of material based to the topic we were talking about. And that just didn't feel like it got traction in an online format. So I switched gears and I made modern equivalents. And I'll give you an example. So we talk about in Prehistoric to Gothic Survey, medieval pilgrimages. So those are super important, and it's really essential that students understand the place of that in driving architectural change and funding art. So I just had a discussion about a modern pilgrimage and what would a student sacrifice to have an in-person experience. So you know, I got these really interesting answers, and I could tell that they were understanding the importance of a pilgrimage in medieval Europe to a person living in that time period. I'll just give you a quick example. Like one student said, yeah, he got it because the Beatles were really important to his mother. And so I think probably when they were in high school, she took her 2 sons on a pilgrimage to significant places for the Beatles in England. So I find that I have really high participation and pretty enthusiastic participation in those modern equivalents that show me that the students are picking up the concept. Other kind of COVID safe things that have done and will do again is that like when we're talking about classical architecture, Greek and Roman, then I ask them to be sure that I know that they know what these architectural elements look like, that they have to go around town and find a classical element and then take a picture of themselves in front of that element. I haven't yet, but I want to put these on a Padlet or a digital board so they can sort of see that they're a class and they're all working on these projects together, and they can sort of compare what others have done. The same with street art. In a contemporary art class, we look at street art, so they have to go out and find examples of that, or like non-objective public sculpture examples. And so those are some of the things that they can do that are sort of COVID safe. The win is that I think that there's a bit of camaraderie in finding those things and seeing what other people have come up with. The downside is every semester, I really build up to taking my class on a Saturday all-day field trip in Los Angeles. Depending on the class, we go to different places. And I love to see students outside the classroom, and I think they get a kick of about seeing me outside the classroom. And, you know, we have a good exchange as we walk through museums or take architectural tours. So that's definitely a bummer that that's not available right now. But as I say, there are wins and losses. And, you know, overall, I remain committed to making the experience the best possible. And I just keep kind of as a centerpiece as I'm working pretty much every day this summer to create these classes that I want to help students be as successful as possible in the online format when it's not a format that either of us chose to learn in. So hopefully that gets some conversation started, but those are the remarks that and the thoughts that I wanted to share today about art history and embracing distance learning. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joy. I really appreciate it. Joy Kunz, everyone. We'll be back with some questions in a moment, but first, let me turn it to Professor Blake Barron and ask you how you're embracing distance learning in the biology department. Blake.
So thank you, Joy. It was wonderful to hear from the art department. And I just want to share a few slides here. We're working through this and treat you a little bit like a Zoom class as we go through this. And we're you know, in a forced situation for a lot of faculty and some faculty on campus who've been doing this for a long time. And I'm a little grayer than when I first got hired. So I've done this a little bit of time, not as long as some. So a little bit on the embracing distance learning concept here. And thank you, Jeff and the foundation for inviting me to join in the chat. And the main thing here is I want to keep in mind that there's a lot of individual variation. You're going to see that across disciplines. You're going to see it across different faculty members within the same discipline. You know, this is a concept that, you know, harks back to, you know, the Renaissance and some of the work that gets taught, of course, in art history and Van Eyck and the idea of inventing new techniques and discovering new ways to present things to people. And in science, that's kind of our bread and butter, right? That's what we do. And the biological sciences department, actually with the leadership of Larry Friesen, had some of the first online courses on campus. We had the very first entirely online major in natural history. And we've been doing this for a while. So we're practiced at some aspects of it, but not all of us. There's a lot of variation within different subject matter within any particular department. Our department is varied even within the sciences division as a whole. Not surprisingly, the way that you teach chemistry online is not going to be the same way that you might teach a course in, say, biology for non-majors, right? I've taught a lot of courses over my time here at City College. Currently in the fall and spring, I teach 2 different courses. One is the Biological Sciences 102 Animal Biology class. It's the second in a 3-course sequence that biomajors take. It's hardcore, it's 5 units. It has 2 3-hour labs a week. It's intense for students. It's really the course where they discover if they're gonna kind of figure it out to be a doctor and a research scientist and a marine biologist and that kind of stuff. And we teach the principles of biology in the context of zoology. And then a fun non-majors class that's really dear to my heart because it's about the biology of human sexuality. And as I was a trained reproductive physiologist, so this one's important to me. It's a non-majors course. It's meant for the comm majors and art history majors and poli-sci majors, and it fulfills area 5B of IGETSI, which is the life science requirement. But basically it uses sex to teach biology. And if I can't get you jazzed about biology using that topic, I probably have no hope for you. So it's a fun class to teach, but the way you teach them online, of course, has to vary. For any class I'm going to teach, regardless of whether it's going to be online or face-to-face, I try and keep a few things in mind. In today's world in particular, of course, the equity mindset that we've been focused on campus for the last several years in particular, particularly with the Affective Learning Institute, is critical. And we have to be mindful of the fact that different students learn in different ways in different classes from different instructors. And the idea that just because you've got a class out there and you're teaching to them does not mean that they're learning. You have to talk to your students. As Joy mentioned, the critical thing here is that communication and contact. We have to generate that sense of community. One of the things that I was able to do as we jumped in the spring was we met face-to-face for our courses at the beginning of spring 2020, but then we had to quickly transition to online. And for my 102 course, I'd never taught that course online. but I had the benefit of generating some of that community building face-to-face already. That's a little bit more of a challenge in the online environment. That online communication is absolutely critical, by email, by face-to-face Zoom meetings. I actually opened up my office hours. I basically told all my students, hey, if you want to schedule an individual Zoom meeting, I'm not having to make the commute from Ventura. I've got more time on my hands. Let me help you. And I did a lot of the regular kind of counseling that I would do with students on careers and transfer and what classes to take and how to write papers in individual Zoom meetings. And that worked out really well. So that helps to maintain some of that connection. And I think in today's world in particular, with a pandemic going on within a pandemic, we have to work to maintain this sense of inspiration and hope. It's something we're so good at doing at the community college level, and I've seen so many students' success in this. I was lucky enough to connect with Dan Anderson, one of our brightest students coming out of our department last week. He's at MIT finishing his PhD, and he's actually working on some COVID stuff. And he brought up how important his time at City College was to him to provide that ability for him to get to MIT, for instance, right? So those concepts, they apply in all kinds of scenarios. I've been teaching online for over a decade in various kinds of formats. I've learned a few things. A lot of people know a lot more than I do, and a lot of people do it in different ways. This idea of individual variation and adaptation is really important in biology. They're part of our core concepts, so they kind of sit right in front of us. I like to give my students lots of different ways to learn the material: the textbook, the Zoom lectures, a website, access to various internet sources. For both of my classes, when we made the transition in the spring, I used synchronous Zoom lectures and then left the asynchronous recordings for people to go over. And I was able to pretty quickly adapt things because I'd done it for a while and I had a YouTube channel and that kind of stuff. Michelle Paddock and I will be co-teaching this class in the fall, and we made a bunch of quick videos with the lab before everything sort of shut down. So we're able to use those. I'm going to show you some quick examples here of a tremendous array of online tutorials, lab simulations that are available from textbook companies and other companies that allow you to apply some concepts, sometimes well, sometimes not so well, to be frank. Like Joy mentioned, the opportunity for students to do some things at home. They can do backyard bird watching. I did that in my 102 class. We can have them take a walk on the beach, socially distance, and some safe things that we can do there. Not everything and not a lot of things, but some stuff. So just a few pictures to show you kind of what this looks like. This is sort of the landing page for all of my courses. I've been coding a little bit here and there and know enough to get myself in trouble to be able to design our own web courses. Many of the science division faculty have been doing this for years. Larry's courses are well known for how beautiful they are. And we all kind of teach in our different sort of format. There's just one of the pages off that website. My students have to learn the taxonomy of a bunch of different organisms. They have to know what the critters look like. They have to know their scientific names. So this is a set of electronic flashcards I built a long time ago for them to basically self-study at home. There's a lot of these kinds of resources that science division faculty have invented on their own outside of what's available commercially. So there's a lot of technologies out there. Like I mentioned, everybody's pretty well familiar with Zoom at this point. One of the things I'll be incorporating more in the fall is actually using the polls function so that I can ask students questions and get summaries of those questions actively in the lecture. Traditionally in my lecture classes, what I would do is I would write 10 questions on the board when the lecture started, and then I would call students down to the front of the room and they have to write the answers on the board at the beginning of the lecture and explain it to the class. And so there are some ways to do that online if you practice them. Having students do breakout rooms, this is really important to getting at some of those issues of equity sometimes when you're doing a breakout group work. You can set them up in separate breakout rooms in Zoom. I was fortunate enough to have an amazing array of 7 peer-assisted learning tutors from my 102 class. We jumped them on Zoom right away, and they were able to tutor my students using Zoom for the rest of the semester. In addition to the various videos and other things that I mentioned, Google Slides and Google Docs are something that science students are fairly familiar with in the beginning, and they'll use those Google Docs to share information across study sessions, for instance. There's a very long, laborious review sheet for the exams in my class, and they'll work together on those. They'll use Google Docs, Google Slides rather, to build their slide presentations. So the Zoom lecture thing, you've seen the format before probably. This is from my sexuality class when I talk about AIDS, and I pulled it because obviously COVID provides an opportunity for us in the biology department to talk about a lot of topics very relevant to today, and we've incorporated those into our classrooms, not just on the science side of things, but also on some of the aspects of the sociobiology. We've also done a lot of YouTube videos on our own. This is a picture of me talking about horse legs. To do some comparative anatomy in one of my classes from one of the YouTube videos Michelle and I made. There are a lot of online resources. There's a series of online animations at the DNA Learning Center that comes out of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory that they've done for years that are detailed animations of complex biological concepts that are challenging for students to learn, and obviously they can watch these multiple times. There are a lot of commercially available things that we're actually looking at now. We've used a few of these in the sciences division, but we're looking at them in more detail now. A lot of the problems with some of the commercially produced labs are they're either too elementary, or they lack some of the finer details or some of the concepts that we're trying to cover. So we're trying to evaluate which of those are useful, which are not. For any particular class, is it better to go with Labster? So for instance, in physics and chemistry, they've been using Labster for some of their courses to simulate some things. PhysioX is a software program we've used in our physiology classes for years to illustrate a few physiological concepts. It's not the same as the real world experience, but you can do data analysis relatively effectively in a lot of these formats. SimBio is one of the ones that Michelle and I are looking at for some of the labs for the 102 course, for some of the aspects of evolution and natural selection. They have some interesting simulations there. I might, if there's time, I'll show you one at the end. Obviously, there's benefits and disadvantages to all this. The strong benefits of this is that students have 24/7 access to things. As you can tell, I talk pretty fast, right? So the advantage for students is they can stop me, they can slow it down, and they can take better notes, right? They love that. Me, Jess Estrada in chemistry, a lot of us. The ability for them to view those things at multiple times, at a time that works for them. Most of our students are working 2 jobs to pay for rent in this town. And so in order to be able to accommodate that, that's useful to them. They do get practice in Zoom, right? Zoom is everywhere now. It was before, but now it's literally everywhere. And they're probably going to experience this in their careers in the future. They're going to be adept at that, as well as some other software platforms. And also we have found, not with all, and I wouldn't say with most, but with some students who are more introverted, more shy. I'm a person who actually values introversion in my students. And we don't, as a society, I think, value the introverts as much as we probably should, but sometimes they will come out of their shell in the online environment. It is somewhat more anonymous. There are some things there that I think help out some of those students. So there are some advantages definitely to teaching online, but there are some disadvantages as well, particularly for the sciences. One of the things we're really struggling with right now is, for me personally, probably the biggest struggle I'm having is it's very important to me to generate this feeling and sense of community. There is an energy in the classroom with the teachers teaching and the students trying to learn that you cannot replicate as well in the online environment when somebody's sitting in their bedroom in their PJs. It doesn't happen as well. I know this because I talk to my students a lot. I'm the faculty advisor for the biology club. I do a lot of advising for the biology department students, and they talk to me honestly. And it's a problem for them. They're concerned about that. And so we're trying to come up with the best ways. Joy mentioned several, and I've alluded to some as well, to deal with some of those issues. That one-on-one contact is critical, particularly relative to the equity mindset and paying attention to those students who sometimes we lose track of, right? You have to be very, very thoughtful and attentive to all of the students in your classes in an online environment. In particular in science, it's the labs. You don't have a microscope at home. You don't have a PCR machine, right? That's a $10,000 piece of equipment. There's no way, it is impossible for me to teach a student how to use a microscope. It's the equivalent of saying, I'm going to teach you how to be a Major League Baseball player, but you're never allowed to pick up a bat. It's just, there's no way to really do it. We all know that observation is important to learning, but experience is where the real learning happens. So we can simulate a lot of these things. We can make up for some of the deficiencies, but it's some of the stuff I'm sure they struggle with to some degree in the art studio classes, for instance, right?
Okay.
And That's one of the things where we're trying to figure out how we can do that. And then are there going to be any options moving forward in, maybe in the spring or perhaps in the fall in a very limited format safely, where we might be able to do just a few of those things that we can't do online. Access for some students we know has been an issue with equipment. The foundation and the college has been amazing in getting equipment out to our students and dealing with the Wi-Fi issue. But it is something that still pops up. We see it in the Zoom sessions where it's not a good Wi-Fi connection, right? And then frankly, for me, there's this word that has a negative connotation to it, but it's actually really important in teaching, and that's intrusiveness. We thought for a long time that it was better for us to not be too intrusive with our students. We need to be more intrusive. We need to be in them. We need to be with them all the time. It's okay if I send a lot of emails. My students tell me, you know what, it reminds me to do stuff. The hardest thing my students struggled with this last semester was motivation. And having the synchronous Zoom lectures, having that more constant contact, having those regular email updates, having the discussion forums, that gave them something to do. It gave them this ability to feel more connected. I have to be very attentive as a faculty member. And when I see a student's not turned into assignments, I have to email them. I can't wait for them to email me. By then it's too late. I have to make sure I'm being attentive to get to them so that I can find out what's going on with them. Because in my experience, most of the struggles our students are having are not relative to their abilities and their academics, but usually other things going on in their lives. So lots of challenges, but definitely some benefits out there. And what I would do is say it works, right? I was able to maintain some great mentor relationships with my students. Two of my mentees have transferred to UC and CSU in the last couple of weeks. We're working up some virtual biology club activities for next year if we can, and some work to do on the labs. The students are not thrilled with the way the labs are online at this point, but verbose as usual, but be safe, be responsible, be active and well, and we're happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Blake. Thank you both. So let me start with, I've got a few questions here, and there have been a few that have been submitted as well, but I want to start at high level. You both, I saw actually the word STEM. I was waiting for STEM or STEAM to pop up in somebody's remarks, and I saw it in Blake's. So my question is this: STEM or STEAM? Explain. Can you talk a little bit about how you conceive of the connection with the arts and the sciences? I mean, this has been one of those debates that's been out there, well, much more intensely lately. But I'm gonna nix the concerns.
I'm gonna nix the concerns on the science perspective. For me, it's always been STEAM, right? There is an art to science, and there's a lot of science and art, right? We taught courses that art was the focus. We have a biological illustration class actually on the books in the biology department. All those beautiful drawings in medical school textbooks, there's a lot of art out there. So I think the cultural framework of this is something that sometimes scientists are thought of as sterile and we're thought of as not being approachable, and that's something we have to work on. That's our responsibility. And I love the art that I see in the lab notebooks that my students produce. My human sexuality class, one of the options they have for their presentation is they don't have to do a slide presentation. They can do a sculpture. They can write poetry. I've had rap songs. I've had all kinds of things done. I've had some interesting sculptures in that class, right? So yeah, Joy?
Well, a lot of students take art history, as I mentioned, initially because they're fulfilling a requirement, and then they find out that they really like it as a discipline on its own. But initially, I say that they're learning this really important capability and pattern of thinking, that they're holding multiple interpretations. You know, sometimes people get frustrated. They just want to know, what does that work of art mean? And so this ability to hold multiple interpretations, to pull those interpretations from different sources, I think now more than ever, we see that all of the sciences are nuanced too. Where do you get your information from? How do you find out if it's valid or not? How does that thinking condition the outcome? And so I think people tend to think of art and science as very different, but I think some of the kind of intellectually critical, rigorous thought patterns might have more in common than a lot of people think. And I think that the disciplines together are excellent training too for developing a mature brain in our students.
One last thing on that, Jeff. One of the things we try and teach in the sciences is your data is critical, your sources are critical, you have to vet things, we have to apply the scientific method. But to be frank, in the world we live in, if it doesn't look good, nobody's going to look at it. That's art.
Or design, a lot of graphic design.
That's right. Well said. Well, so on a similar vein, you both referenced how you teach. I mean, I think, Joy, you said that yes, you accidentally fell into art history and mentioned that, but it was also that you appreciated the connection that it had with virtually everything else. I mean, every other subject was somehow addressed in that. So in this moment that we're in right now, how do you process or apply, and do you actually intentionally apply the lessons or the teaching in your own class with the historical moment? And this now we've gone through several sort of traumas in a row now. So whether it's about how a pandemic and human behavior works, or how it's about racism in our country and how society is structured, or I mean, how do you take each of your subjects and actually?
Yeah. Well, I said I'm working on these lectures because I know if I try to do lectures for 5 classes during the academic year, there's not enough hours in the day. So yesterday I was working on artists in the 1970s that started to make these environments and installations. And Ed Kienholz is one of the greats in that. And so I thought, I want to talk about his 5-car stud. And it was done in 1969 against the backdrop of all the racial unrest that was going on in the United States. It was shown in 72, and then it was just locked up, and it was brought out and showed at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in 2012. It's such a powerful, disturbing piece. There are 5 physical cars, and the large building that it's in is all dark, and you see these white men pinning down a black man who's been hauled out of a car because he was in a car with a white woman. I mean, it's the most horrific piece. And I just found myself during lectures saying, it is so sad that we have not progressed farther from where we find ourselves right now. So yeah, I always, I think art can be kind of an elitist subject, but my God, it doesn't have to be. To me, it's just looking at my fellow human beings dealing with issues that are so important. So yeah, I tend to bring it in as often as I can, because I think we make a work of art live. If it just sits in a museum, it's not alive. So we have to bring meaning that we generate from our lives to that work of art.
Thank you for that. Blake, how about you? How do you apply, I mean, you referenced your human sexuality class. There's certainly a lot of current, you showed the first report on the AIDS epidemic. I mean, there's a lot of current affairs in that, I imagine, but what about the current moment?
Yeah, there's the obvious science, right? So there's multiple aspects of this. But one of the things I try and relate to students is it's not just the idea of, okay, there's this incredible virology going on right now where a lot of people don't realize that, the fastest we've developed a vaccine previous to this was several years, about 4 years. And so to get to where we are with potential vaccines in just 2-3 months is incredible. So the science is really amazing, but I keep talking to my wife and some other people about, I think the PhDs that come out in sociology on this are going to be really amazing. And some of the social sciences work that's going to come out of how people were responding to the epidemic is really interesting. We've brought in this aspect of individual variation into biology and the sciences for years. One of the classic examples of talking about evolution is the fact that in the African American population, there are higher rates of sickle cell anemia And that relates because it's an adaptation to malaria, which is found in higher concentrations in areas where we find those populations. And those kinds of sort of ties of genetics and showing people that in fact we're all from the same gene pool. It's really easy to relate when you're starting to talk about the human brain. And the more you dig basically beyond the skin and deeper into the body, people start to realize how, in fact, similar people are, not just to each other, but in fact to the rest of the animal world. So I think one of the things that science probably struggles with is, as scientists, we spend so much time in our graduate school training and otherwise focused on the scientific methodology and the aspects of data collection and being objective and so on. It's only recently where you're starting to see scientists willing, frankly, to open up and put their foot into the arena of politics and the arena of thinking about how the culture in which they're doing science is really important. And that's something we have to be thinking about as we're educating our students in this day and age.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions specifically for each of you, so I just want to make sure we honor these. Bill Dinklage is asking you, Joy, you referenced 2 personal responses per student per week. Was that with a summer course, or was that in your spring course that you were?
That's how I finished out my spring course. But then that I don't personally respond to quizzes and things like that. So there are other assignments that they're completing. But in terms of discussion and any written responses, yeah, I'm responding twice a week to each student.
Right. And then for you, Blake, Larry Friesen's asking how you're introducing, and you mentioned this, that some things that are a little harder to do digitally, but a dissection of a variety of animals for Bio 102. And I can't believe I'm asking this on live, but I'm going to say, how long is a video of a shark dissection, Blake?
Yeah, it can be long. It depends on how good and detailed your shark dissection is, I suppose. But keep in mind, it's not just my class we do with animals. We teach the human anatomy class for all of the pre-nursing students. It's a huge part of our program. Most people, I would hope, don't have a dead body at home that they can study from. So the biomedical sciences faculty has done amazing work over the course of the summer of developing their own videos because they weren't happy with what they were finding online, to be able to demonstrate at least some of the dissection procedures and details of human anatomy as appropriate and as per what the legal requirements are for that. It's a little easier for us in the animal world, but yeah, I can't really send a frog to every student in the mail. So there are a lot of online things like virtual frog dissections and things like that, but it isn't the same thing. You don't have the feel of the scalpel in your hand, and you don't see the 3-dimensionality of a lot of the organ systems there. And so it's something we're really trying to figure out. We're hoping, you know, that at least we have maybe a tiny bit of face-to-face contact with our students so we can do at least some of those things that are really just impossible to do. We do a dissection of an earthworm in my class. It's actually an amazing dissection if you've never done it. There's a lot inside one of those little things if you've never done it. And there are good general discussion model for invertebrate biology. You know, I could mail an earthworm to every student. That's just something that's, you know, that's something that's available at a bait shop, right? It's those kinds of things where what's something that's safe, that's legal, that's reasonable for a student to do. Something that's not cost prohibitive kinds of things where maybe it's a little bit like your backyard bird watching. But yeah, some of the other things are definitely more challenging.
So thank you for that. Now, you both mentioned synchronous and asynchronous teaching, and I imagine most folks on the call are familiar with those terms, but can each of you explain a little bit more about the value, the pros and cons of each of those strategies? Synchronous, of course, being live, everyone logs on, watches you do your thing, listens to you. Asynchronous being you record it and then they can access it at any time. And I imagine there's some blending there, as both of you mentioned. But can you just say a few words about the relative value of each of those strategies in this moment? Comment?
Well, I'll say I probably have chosen asynchronous because initially in the spring, there was so much there's so many students scattered. I had international students that were working in different time zones and had to go into 2-week quarantines when they returned to their country. And so they would have periods without internet, and I wanted them to be able to finish the course successfully. So it just seemed like a no-brainer to me to go that route. It felt fairest and most equitable. So people, you know, at different times in their building, they would even have better internet or not. I don't know if I'm up to the task of running a lot of Zoom for up to 50 people at a time. But maybe I get to know that technology. Maybe that's something that I work on developing. But right now, I feel pretty available to students in terms of emailing and more individual contact. So I just made the decision not to do synchronous instruction. But I do want them to have the feel of my voice and such. And so that's why I'm not just putting my notes up and the digital presentation up.
Thank you. Blake, what about you for those two strategies?
Yes, you know, and again, everyone's got to keep in mind different instructors are going to have different strategies for different classes, and I think different things work for different students as well. I stuck with the synchronous Zoom lectures mostly because I built this connection with my students. I didn't want to lose that. They told me they valued it. They let me know right away, hey, I like seeing you. I like seeing my classmates all in the same space together. You know, I've taught big classes for a long time. There's 90 people in my 102 class with 3 lab sections and 30 in the sexuality class. So it wasn't challenging for me along those lines, but the ability for students to ask questions in the moment, in real time, they found that to be beneficial. There's a little bit of data out there to show that for some of our underserved populations and our populations where we're particularly concerned about equity, that synchronous lecturing via Zoom or some other platform seems to help them more. You have to make everything asynchronous as well. You cannot only do the Zoom recordings. With regards to the online format and student schedules, and particularly if they're signing up for an online class, you can't require them to be there at a certain time. We need more flexibility for our students. And so having both options was a great benefit to me, where I could make that connection with my students, but then they also had the asynchronous one available, both so if they missed a class, if they got sick, if they had childcare issues, they could do that. And also, of course, they could review the lecture more carefully and slowly. So there's, I think, advantages and disadvantages to both, but I think if you can do both, that's probably the greatest benefit.
You know, Nikki Parr just chimed in with one related question. That is, in this remote environment, are you finding you need to be more available to students than you might have been in the in-person world, where they would have an opportunity sort of naturally to see you or interact? Do you find that you need to make specific times to reach out? I know, Joy, you mentioned the two direct responses per week per student. Do you have a comparison yet, or is this too new to really know?
Well, go ahead, Blake. I bet take it.
I guess, yeah. I do a lot of, I'll be honest, there's usually a line outside my office. Students come to see me because I'm fairly approachable. I don't know, I try and make this connection in class. And so they come to talk to me a lot. So it's probably about the same. It's probably in reality the part that was the most challenging for me is I actually saw my students less after we made the conversion to Zoom, because I wasn't seeing them in office hours as easily. I don't think it was as easy for them to, even though I was very clear, I want to be open and adapt my schedule to meet you whenever I can in a personal session as needed. That was harder for them. I think part of that is them adapting to the technology. I think that will get easier for them with time as this goes on with, you know, other courses and other campuses and after they transfer and so on. But I felt that disconnect, they felt that disconnect, and it requires that if I'm going to maintain that connection with them and that open line of communication where they feel comfortable doing that, I have to be the one that's willing to open my schedule up, right? Particularly with 90 students, and I'm happy to do that. That's my job.
How about you, Joy? Any noticeable difference as far as how?
Yeah, I think the simple things, if someone's not figuring out how to upload something to a portal, you know, Matt Mooney has suggested these, you know, phone numbers where they can text or individual Zoom. I feel like via email, I'm very available and I have a pretty quick response time to students, but I do feel like there's something to just visually seeing each other and, you know, screen sharing or something like that to say, this is how you do it. I probably, I mean, I know my comfort with certain technologies around online teaching will necessarily increase.
Well, we're going to wrap up, but I want to give you each a chance to say a few final words or words of wisdom. Oh, here's another question. I'm going to toss it out. Bill, you got another one here. Are you, like you mentioned, the larger classes, are you planning on keeping those in the online format, or do you think it makes sense to cap those less than 90, you know, maybe 50 or 40 in an online environment, those lectures?
I think it would certainly be easier for faculty to manage it. If it was a smaller class like 50, I'll be keeping it at 90 because our students absolutely have to have this course. Michelle and I are the only person who teaches this course, and if I limit that course, it significantly affects the transferability for our students. So even if I wanted to, I'm not going to be comfortable doing that. Fortunately, I'm fairly comfortable in that environment. You know, even if there's 90 students, remember, they're not all going to come to every lecture. So, you know, it ends up being more 60 or 70 or 50 even sometimes, and that's okay. So I'll be keeping it the same. Remember, they do break up into their smaller lab sections for the lab meetings as well. So that provides that opportunity for that one-on-one connection.
You want to roll into final thoughts or words of wisdom since we got you, Blake, or anything?
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to the community for supporting Santa Barbara City College as well as you have for so long and in this interesting environment and world that we're living on. So please continue to do that. We really appreciate all the efforts there. And, you know, I'm just thankful to be able to still be able to teach and interact with my students and have this incredible opportunity to be part of the beginning of their futures and onward, even in this very challenging environment and times that we live in. So
thank you so much. Joy, final thoughts, or you want to share?
Well, there's, you know, in every sort of situation, there's a silver lining. So in my audio lectures, I'm starting to take a kind of smaller bits of information and think about presenting it in different ways. And I'm convinced at the end I'll come out a stronger teacher. And even though we're physically more alone, I do feel a lot of camaraderie with my colleagues at SBCC, and I do feel supported. And so that's been nice. You know, sometimes I get so busy at school, I just run in the classroom, up to my office, back and forth, seeing students. And now I think I'm sort of reaching out or connecting more with faculty, and that feels really good. And I'm so impressed with what people are doing. And it seems like so many of you have your heart in the right place to make it work for our students. So I appreciate the invitation, and it was fun to pair up with the science department. Thank you, Blake, and thanks to everybody.
Great, thank you, Joy. So ladies and gentlemen, a big hand for, I know we can't do that in live meetings, we would do this, but Joy Kunz of the Art History Department, Blake Barron of Biology, Biological Sciences. We are going to keep doing this so long as there is interest, and there seems to be interest. So on behalf of the SBCC Foundation, I want to thank all of you for signing on. As Raisa said at the front end, this will be edited and put up, not edited, just very, very briefly to make it look pretty. We're going to keep it all in there, and that will be up on our website at sbccfoundation.org. And at this point, a few of these in, I do want to shout out a couple of my colleagues. Raisa Smarl, our Senior Director of Individual Philanthropy, who you met at the top of the hour. Rachel Johnson has been a key part of making this happen, and Jennifer LeMay, our Director of Communications, Marketing Communications. And by the way, Rachel is our Director of Grant Making. So we have a team behind this, and it makes it very easy, and I'm very grateful for them as well. So thank you all, and we will hopefully see you next time.
Bye, thanks, Jeff.
Thanks all.